I was 14 when I first realized something was wrong with Pastor Greaves. That's what Ethan and I called him, behind his back, of course. His real name was Pastor Mitchell, but the way his long, hooked nose twitched when he looked at my little sister made the nickname stick. He was the kind of man who made your skin crawl, even if you couldn't quite explain why. My mom adored him, though. She'd invite him over for dinner at least twice a week, smiling as he blessed the food with that slow, deliberate voice of his. He'd sit at our table, laughing at my mom's stories, but his eyes, they always lingered on Emma just a little too long. She was 12 then, 2 years younger than me, and she barely spoke at the dinner table, always keeping her head down. But that didn't stop him from trying to get close to her. He'd pat her head, squeeze her shoulder, and sometimes, he'd ask her to sit next to him while they talked about church events. I hated it. I told my mom he gave me the creeps, but she just waved me off. "He's a man of God, Ryan," she'd say. "Don't be disrespectful." But I knew better. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, sometime after midnight, when I woke up to the sound of soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch against the window. My room was on the second floor, after all. But something felt off. The tapping wasn't random. It came in steady, deliberate beats. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest, and turned toward the window. And that's when I saw him. Pastor Greaves stood in our backyard, staring up at my window. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over his face, making his already sharp features look skeletal. But it was his eyes that sent ice down my spine, wide, unblinking, reflecting the dim glow like a predator's. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was whispering something. I froze. Then, as if sensing my fear, his mouth stretched into that too wide smile, his yellowed teeth gleaming in the darkness. I screamed. The sound tore through the silence of the house, jolting me into action. I scrambled out of bed and stumbled toward the door as hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. My mom burst in, followed closely by Emma, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Ryan? What the hell is going on?" my mom demanded, her voice sharp with panic. It was him. I gasped, pointing at the window. Pastor Greaves. He was outside, staring at me. Mom rushed to the window, but by the time she looked out, the yard was empty. "There's no one there," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. "He was there, I swear." Emma hugged herself, her small frame trembling. She hadn't seen him, but something in her expression told me she believed me. Mom, however, let out a frustrated sigh. "You probably had a nightmare," she said, running a hand through her hair. "You've been acting paranoid about Pastor Mitchell for weeks now. I won't have you disrespecting him like this." I wanted to argue, but the look on her face told me it was useless. She wouldn't believe me. But I knew what I saw. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew this was just the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his wide, hungry grin, the way his lips moved like he was whispering a secret only I could hear. By morning, I felt like I hadn't rested at all. Mom acted like nothing had happened. She hummed as she made breakfast, chatting about the church's upcoming fundraiser like I hadn't woken up screaming in the middle of the night. Emma, though, was different. She sat quietly at the table, barely touching her cereal, her hands curled into fists on her lap. I wanted to ask her if she had seen anything, but I knew Mom would shut it down the second I brought it up. "Eat your food, Ryan," she said, sliding a plate in front of me. "You look awful." Yeah, no kidding. The entire day felt off. When I got home from school, I checked the backyard, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt, proof that Pastor Greaves had been there. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, like he had never stood there at all. But I knew what I saw. That night, I forced myself to stay awake. I kept my blinds shut and sat on my bed with the baseball bat I'd stolen from the garage. My heart pounded in my chest with every creak of the house, every distant rustle of the wind. At some point, exhaustion must have won because I woke up to the sound of whispers. Low. Muffled. Like someone was speaking from just outside my door. I sat up, my body rigid with fear. The whispers were soft, but I could make out my name. Ryan. Ryan. I held my breath. My room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of my door. It was slightly open, just a sliver. A shadow moved beyond it. I clutched the bat, my fingers trembling. Then the whispering stopped. For a long moment, I just sat there, waiting. And then, a single, slow tap on my window. My stomach twisted into knots. No. No, no, no. I turned my head, dread pooling in my chest. The blinds were shut. But from behind them, I could see a dark shape pressed against the glass. He was there. I could hear him breathing. I could hear him whispering my name. Ryan. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. Then. Creak. The bedroom door opened just a little wider. The creak of the door sent a spike of fear through my chest. I gripped the baseball bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. The room was deathly silent. Outside the door, the hallway was dark. Our nightlight, usually casting a faint glow from the wall near Emma's room, was out. Just, gone. The only light came from the thin slice of moonlight filtering through my window blinds, stretching long, eerie shadows across my floor. Something was out there. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The air in my room felt thick, suffocating. Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the hallway. My heart slammed against my ribs. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door as quietly as possible. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingers curling around the handle. With one deep breath, I yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But the air was wrong. It was too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped out, gripping the bat, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. A noise came from the living room, a faint shuffle, like someone shifting their weight. I crept forward, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back, to run. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Familiar. Ryan. My stomach dropped. It was coming from Emma's room. I sprinted down the hall, bursting through her door. Emma was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, her blanket clutched to her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. Her eyes darted past me, to the doorway. Her face paled. "Ryan, behind you." A chill ran down my spine. I turned, slowly, afraid of what I'd see. And there, standing in the hallway, half shrouded in darkness, was Pastor Greaves. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, his too wide smile stretching across his face. "What are you two doing up so late?" he whispered. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Because right then, I realized something. The front door was still locked. He had never come in. He was never supposed to be here. Emma let out a tiny, strangled gasp, her fingers tightening around the blanket. I stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the bat so hard my hands ached. Pastor Greaves didn't belong here. He couldn't be here. But he was. He stood in the hallway like he had every right to be there, his shadow stretching long and twisted in the dim moonlight. His smile never faltered, his hooked nose twitching slightly as he breathed. "You shouldn't be wandering the house so late, Ryan." His voice was quiet, almost gentle. It's dangerous. My throat was dry. My heart pounded. How did you get in? I finally forced out, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled, soft and amused. I've always been here. A cold wave of terror crashed over me. Emma whimpered, shifting closer to me, and Pastor Greaves's eyes flicked toward her. You're shaking, sweetheart. Are you cold? His smile widened. Come here. I'll keep you warm. Emma let out a quiet sob, shaking her head violently. Something in me snapped. I lifted the bat and took a step forward. Get out. My voice was stronger now, steadier. Get the hell out of our house. For the first time, his expression changed. The smile faltered, just for a second. Then, just as quickly, it was back, but there was something darker behind it now. Such harsh words, he murmured. That's not very Christian of you. I didn't care. I raised the bat higher, my muscles tensed, ready to swing. Leave. Pastor Greaves sighed, shaking his head like I had disappointed him. Very well. Then, he turned and walked away. Just like that. Emma and I stood frozen, watching as his shadow disappeared down the hallway. A second later, we heard the faint click of the front door. He was gone. But I knew, this wasn't over. Emma let out a shaky breath. Ryan, he was in my room before you came in. My stomach twisted. What? Her lips trembled. I woke up, and he was standing by my bed. A cold shudder ran down my spine. I reached for her hand and squeezed it. We're telling Mom in the morning. But deep down, I already knew what would happen. She wouldn't believe us. She never did. The next morning, Emma and I sat at the kitchen table, barely touching our breakfast. The house felt normal, too normal. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the room with warmth, as if nothing had happened last night. But I knew better. I could still hear the whisper of Pastor Greaves's voice in the dark. I could still feel the weight of his stare. Mom hummed as she poured herself a cup of coffee, completely oblivious to the terror that had taken root inside her own house. I took a deep breath. Mom, we need to talk. She glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. That sounds serious. Emma gripped my hand under the table. She was still pale, dark circles under her eyes from a night of no sleep. I didn't sugarcoat it. Pastor Greaves was in the house last night. Mom blinked. What? Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. He was in my room. For a moment, she just stared at us. Then, she let out a soft laugh. Oh, honey, you must have had a nightmare. It wasn't a nightmare, I snapped. I saw him. He spoke to us. Mom sighed, setting down her coffee. Ryan, do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? Pastor Greaves would never do something like that. We're not lying. Emma's voice cracked. Mom's expression softened. I know you two get nervous sometimes, but you're letting your imagination get the best of you. I clenched my fists under the table. She wasn't listening. She never listened. Mom, I'm telling you, he was in our house. How do you explain that? She gave me a patient smile, like I was a little kid afraid of the dark. Doors can creak. Shadows can play tricks on you. And bad dreams can feel very real. She thought we were making it up. Emma pushed her plate away, her appetite completely gone. I felt the same. Mom sighed, standing up. Maybe it's my fault for letting you watch those scary movies. You need to stop filling your head with nonsense. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. Whatever. Just don't blame me when something happens. Mom shook her head, muttering something under her breath about teenagers and their dramatics. I stormed off, Emma trailing behind me. As soon as we were out of the kitchen, she whispered, "What do we do now?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Mom wouldn't help us. So we'd help ourselves. I looked at Emma, my jaw set. We find out how he got in. Emma and I spent the next hour searching the house. If Pastor Greaves had gotten inside, there had to be a way, an unlocked door, a broken window, something. But everything was secure. Except for one thing. The basement door. It was locked, just like always. Mom never let us go down there, said it was old and dangerous, with loose floorboards and rusty nails. We never had a reason to question it. Until now. Emma stood beside me, shifting nervously. You really think he came in through here? I wasn't sure. But something about that locked door made my skin crawl. I reached for the knob, twisting it. It didn't budge. Locked. Emma glanced around. Do you think Mom has a key? I frowned. Mom kept her keys in a bowl by the front door. If we were careful, we could check without her noticing. We crept down the hallway. The sound of the TV murmured from the living room, some morning talk show Mom always watched. She wouldn't see us. The key bowl sat on the entryway table. Emma hovered by the doorway while I rifled through the keys. House key, car key, then something smaller. Older. I held it up. A rusted silver key, unlike the others. This had to be it. Emma swallowed. Are we really doing this? I nodded. We need to know. We hurried back to the basement door, my heart hammering in my chest. The key slid into the lock with an unsettling ease. Click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into pitch-black darkness. A damp, musty smell seeped up from below. Emma hesitated. Ryan. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. Stay behind me. We stepped inside. The basement was cold. Much colder than the rest of the house. My light cut through the darkness, revealing dust-covered furniture, boxes stacked against the walls, and old tools hanging from rusted hooks. At first, it looked normal. But then Emma grabbed my arm. Ryan, look. She pointed toward the far wall. At first, I didn't understand. It was just an old wooden shelf, filled with random junk. But then I noticed something strange. The shelf wasn't flush against the wall. There was a gap behind it. A space. I moved closer, reaching out with a shaky hand. The shelf shifted. I felt my breath catch. It wasn't just a shelf. It was a door. I glanced at Emma. Help me move it. Together, we pushed. The shelf groaned against the floor, revealing a hidden passageway leading into more darkness. A cold gust of air rushed out. Emma clutched my arm. I don't like this. Neither did I. But we had already come this far. And something told me, we weren't alone down here. A chill ran down my spine as I stared into the dark passageway behind the shelf. Emma clutched my arm tightly. Ryan, maybe we shouldn't. I swallowed hard. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back. But then I thought of Pastor Greaves. Of the way he whispered Emma's name in the dark. I wasn't about to let this go. I turned my phone's flashlight toward the passage. The walls were made of stone, damp and cracked with age. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic. Something like blood. Stay close to me, I whispered. We stepped inside. The floor sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. My breath came out in shallow puffs. Behind us, the basement door creaked slightly, as if something or someone, was shifting above. Emma whimpered. I hate this. I did too. The passage led to a small chamber, its walls lined with wooden beams. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, deep gouges like they had been scratched by fingernails. My flashlight flickered. Then I saw it. A chair. An old wooden chair sat in the center of the room. Thick leather straps dangled from its arms and legs. Dried blood was smeared across the seat. Emma gasped. Ryan, what is this? I had no words. Scattered around the room were old pieces of fabric, some torn, some stained. I reached down and picked one up. It was a child's dress. Emma grabbed my sleeve, her voice shaking. This is wrong. We need to go. She was right. I turned, and froze. The passage behind us was no longer empty. A shadow stood at the entrance, blocking our only way out. Pastor Greaves. His face was hidden in the darkness, but I knew it was him. I could feel his eyes boring into me. His voice was low, almost amused. You shouldn't have come down here, Ryan. Emma's grip tightened around my arm. Her whole body was trembling. I could feel my own heartbeat hammering in my ears as I stared at the dark figure standing at the entrance of the passage. Pastor Greaves. He didn't move at first. Just stood there, blocking our escape, his head tilted slightly. I could barely make out his face in the dim light of my phone's flickering flashlight, but I knew he was smiling. That same, awful smile. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Ryan, he murmured. His voice was calm, too calm. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Emma whimpered beside me. I felt her nails digging into my arm. I swallowed my fear and stepped in front of her. What is this place? I demanded. What the hell were you doing down here? He exhaled slowly, like a sigh of disappointment. I was hoping you wouldn't find out. But you always were a nosy little boy. His voice turned colder. And now you've made things difficult. Then, he stepped forward. Panic exploded inside me. I grabbed Emma's wrist. Run. We lunged toward the only other exit, the dark, narrow passage deeper into the basement. I didn't know where it led, but anything was better than standing still. Behind us, Pastor Greaves let out a sharp breath, a laugh, and I heard the sound of footsteps. Fast. Coming after us. Emma was crying, her breaths ragged. The tunnel twisted and sloped downward, the walls growing narrower. The air smelled worse, rotting wood, damp earth, something sickly sweet. Then, my foot hit something. I stumbled, nearly falling. My phone slipped from my fingers, skidding across the stone floor. The flashlight landed face down, plunging everything into darkness. Shit. I scrambled blindly, reaching for Emma, trying to find the phone, anything. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not Emma's. Something else. Right next to me. A raspy inhale. A slow, rattling exhale. I froze. Then, cold fingers wrapped around my wrist. I screamed.